Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you for signing up for this and showing up for it. We will be recording, so this will be up on the Cabbage public YouTube page in a couple days. And I want to first off thank Erwin Huebner for coming and for bringing his beautiful vision to us to share. And I'm not going to waste a lot of time on talking about it because he's going to start talking. So I'm going to put the spotlight on him. And yeah, okay. So Erwin, take away.
Okay, why is it not coming up? Share. There it is. Can you see that okay?
Yes, it looks great.
Well, thank you for the invitation and thank you all for attending. So as the title says, I'm going to talk about how artist books are inspired by science. I'm artist in residence at the School of Art at the University of Manitoba, and I'm also a Professor Emeritus in biological sciences. And of course, art and science have had many commonalities over the years. Okay, so the way I've organized this talk is I'm going to give a couple of slides with my personal background and training, and then a brief overview of science and art interrelationships, and then spend most of the talk showing some selected examples of some of my own artist books, what inspired them, the format, and the process of making them. And depending on timing, at the end, I have some non-science books as well. So I grew up in Alberta, in Edmonton. My parents were both artisans. My father was a master goldsmith and chief designer for Henry Burke's, and my mother was an artist working in a variety of media. Both my sisters are trained as artists, graduated from OCA, and Krista, my older sister, also got an MFA from CalArts. My brother was an artist who mostly did sculpture, and he was trained at NASCAD in Halifax and at the Jan van Eyck in the Netherlands. Growing up, I took many art classes at the Edmonton Art Gallery and worked as an engraver for Marvel Engraving in Edmonton. But I also had an interest in science. And so I obtained an honors Bachelor of Science degree in zoology from the University of Alberta, and then a PhD in cell biology at the University of Massachusetts, and then came back to Canada as a postdoctoral fellow at McGill before I was hired here at the University of Manitoba in the Faculty of Science. My research has been in cell and tissue biology, which has involved using a lot of microscopy and imaging. Now, while I've been pursuing science, I've also maintained my activities in a variety of artistic areas, such as photography, photomicrography, printmaking like intaglio, photo etching, and for a number of years now, book arts. My first introduction to actually bookbinding was in a workshop given at the Winnipeg Art Gallery by Louise Genest, a Bronfman awardee in 1997. And since then, I've taken a variety, I don't have a formal degree in bookbinding, but I've taken many workshops since 97 to the present from a variety of people. I've highlighted a few in yellow here. Winnipeg has a very vibrant and incredibly talented Winnipeg Bookies group that includes people like Lorraine Douglas, Nicole Colson, Janet Carroll, Ann Stinner, and Pauline Brown, where we've had a number of workshops on marbling and book arts. I also took a fantastic extensive workshop with Julia Miller on Coptic binding in Calgary a few years back. And leather bookbinding, miniature leather bookbinding workshop with Gabrielle Fox, who's an incredible book artist at the American Academy of Bookbinding in Telluride, and a bookbinding technique taught by Don Glaister, also in Telluride, on montage sur onglets, which is a really interesting binding technique that allows you to open the books, the pages lie flat. And I've taken a number of workshops from Andrew Hoyt and also from Karen Hanmer. I won't go over all this list, but just to show you that I've picked up a lot of variety of techniques from people both teaching in Canada and in the US. Now, of course, science and art has an ancient history, and scientists often say doing science enhances art. And oops, sorry, let me go back. I made a mistake here. And doing art enhances science and vice versa. Of course, Leonardo da Vinci is the most fantastic example of how art and science interface. Another person historically that was really important is Ernst Haeckel, shown here with his assistant, who published this book called Art Forms in Nature, who said nature has created an inexhaustible wealth of wondrous forms whose beauty and diversity way exceed anything that has been created by man. And there have been exhibitions over the years of artist books that are based on science. This one at the Smithsonian in 1995 that was co-curated by Carol Barton. Just took a couple of quotes from that, say that artists find inspiration in science and all kinds of scientific imagery, and both science and artists rely on observation, experimentation, innovative thinking, and when science and artists communicate their discoveries through the combination of images and words, they establish a link between the two fields through the shared format of the book. And another really wonderful book was this book published by the National Museum of the Women in the Arts in Washington by Christina Wasserwerman. And this is the first edition, has been a newer edition, who she says, for me, the brightest heaven of invention is the creative space in which books and art intersect, where imagination takes surprising turns, new ideas, media, and techniques are constantly born. And I found this very inspirational. Now, there's a lot more I could say about the history of artist books, but I think that gives you kind of a couple of examples. My research as a scientist involved the study of how the ovary makes an egg. And this very famous frontispiece in a book published in 1651 by William Harvey shows Zeus sitting on a throne holding an egg from which all these organisms are emerging. And it says all life comes from eggs. So my research has focused on the origin and the development and the cell biology of the female germ cell and how it develops in the ovary. The egg is really the ultimate of stem cells because it can give rise to an entire organism. Here's the egg of a clam. Most of my research was on invertebrates because they were a lot easier to use in the laboratory. And so now I'm going to shift to some examples of my artist books that had been inspired by some of my research activities and the science. So of course, because I worked on eggs, a number of years ago, the Winnipeg Bookie Group was invited to put on a show at the Heritage Gallery at the Mennonite University here in Winnipeg. And the show was called Bound by Nature. So I thought, gee, maybe it could create some books where the binding of the book is actually a natural object. And I experimented with trying to see if I could take quail eggs and use them as covers for books. And after a fair bit of struggling, I managed to cut eggs in half and create a set of books. I called it the Oocyte Cantata in 12 movements. And here you can see the 12 books where the egg shells are the covers. And when you open the book, it's a little concertina book. So here's a brief description of how those were made. The quail eggs were cut in half, which was pretty challenging. And then, because being fragile, lined with Japanese paper, which strengthens the eggshell. And then Japanese paper was used to hinge them so the egg could be opened like a book. And walnut wood was used to carve upright stands so the book would stand upright. And the book inside is a concertina book printed in miniature with images I've taken of different molecular and developmental biology stories, how genes work, how different organs work, contain a series of images, some detail on genetic code, as well as, excuse me, a DNA molecule that runs the length of the book. And then that strip is folded into a concertina. So here's one on the testis, for example, and here's a scale. So here's an example of a book held in my fingers, which is just about embryogenesis in general, and it has some of the development of how an embryo develops. And I've used a few various ways in which to display these books using antique egg cartons. So here is an antique egg carton with a dozen of these. And here's also an antique egg carton that's a wooden box with compartments. This particular 1 dozen carton is actually in the gift shop at the Winnipeg Art Gallery at the moment. And since I was on a roll with making things out of eggs, I took chicken eggs and created a book cover, but inside of it, I put 2 little bookshelves with miniature books on the bookshelves that tell the development story of all the different organs in the body and how they form: the kidney, the brain, the heart, and so forth. And I called it Oof Bibliothèque. Kind of the egg library was kind of a pun about how scientists create molecular libraries. And here's one last example of an egg-based book where here's a stylized DNA molecule of which the shelves are the base pairs of DNA, and on each shelf sits a little egg book, quail egg book, that tell the story of development, how sperm are made, how eggs are made, fertilization, and so forth. This was actually in the Art of the Book show a few years ago, the Cabbage Art of the Book show that toured Canada. Now, I do a lot of work with microscopes, and as you can see from this quote from by Cyril Smith on Structure and Art and Science, a book published in 1965, anyone who works with a microscope for intellectual or practical purpose will frequently pause for a moment of sheer enjoyment of the patterns that he sees, for they have much in common with formal art. And this book, published by Princeton Press by Lynn Gamwell on exploring the invisible, also is a fantastic expose of microscopic art. So a couple of examples of my books that contain microscopic images, and I've spent many, many hours looking at things in the microscope from purely the art perspective. So this is a book I call Peep Show, and here it is in a box that is a modified microscope box to create a book box. And in the cover is a part of a microscope cut in half to highlight that it's a book about microscopy. And the title is embossed in the front cover. It says Peep Show. And the quote from Victor Hugo is, "Where the telescope ends, the microscope begins. Which of the two has a grander view? A glimpse into the beauty and mystery of the micro-universe." And it was a concertina book, as you can see here. And here are a couple of images from that book. These are images taken in the microscope, but created initially. This one was supposed to reflect astronomy. Normally, I don't tell people what the images are of, but this is actually a cloud of fruit fly sperm. Here's a couple more images from that book. So these are all images taken in the microscope. And I like making miniature books, so I made a miniature concertina book with the images reduced and put it into a matchbox with a little microscope slide with a section of a mouse ovary on it. And this was probably one of the more challenging microscope-based books I've made. So here you have a book that you're looking at the front edge of the book that's closed, and you can see the covers are two plexiglass covers, and there's what looks like a microscope. And the concept here is that when you open this book, you're entering the world of microscopy. So, and I called it Inside Outside. So here you can see the cover with the microscope in it. The spine is zebra wood. And here you can see the back view. And when you look at it from the other side, the pages in the book are mounted in brass tubing that is held within a little ebony block so that they can swivel. And so you can turn the pages in the book. And there's one page of text which highlights the history of microscoped imaging being used in a book from the 1600s. And then here are a couple of examples of some of the images in the book. Now, I took an old antique microscope and I cut it in half and cut all the lenses in half. Here you see the two front sides of the microscope and the two cut surfaces. And then the plexiglass covers, I cut out the shape of the microscope and then glued the microscope that was cut in half into that cover. So as you can imagine, this was pretty time consuming, but I think it came out okay. Now here's another book that involves microscopic imaging, and it was a book that was done, excuse me, for a conference held here in Winnipeg for the Prairie Writers group, and it was called Homage to the Linearity of the Prairies. And so I have a concertina book, which has a series of micrograph images, one of which is shown here, and they're contrasted with actual landscape images. Here's another concertina book that involves microscopic image, but in this case, using images taken with a scanning electron microscope. The ones I've shown you so far are all taken with a light microscope. And this book is called Plant Foes and Friends, and it's about insects that are either beneficial to plants or detrimental to plants. And the cover had the friends and foes embossed on the cover. And here is an example of some of the images in that book. Now, one of the original books published in the 1600s of microscopic images was a very famous book done by Robert Hooke in the 1600s, and it was called Micrographia. And one could obtain images from that, high-resolution images from that entire book online. And I thought, gee, it'd be really cool, since I do miniature books, to make a miniature version of it, since it was called Micrographia. So I made, because the book had many, many images, in order to make a miniature book, I made two Coptic bindings, which were a replica now in miniature of his original book. Here you can see an open page of one of them, and here's another one. His book had many illustrations in it that many of them were foldouts. And here's one of his famous illustrations of a flea. And so I created this in miniature using Japanese paper. So the resolution was kept good. And then I took and I found all the same similar objects to what he used and took scanning electron micrograph images of the similar objects using modern techniques and made another book, which I called, which is my own micrographia. And here is my book, and here's my picture of the flea. And it's remarkable how his image of the flea is so accurate, even looking with modern techniques. So here's the original micrographia book at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, England. And it shows you what this book looks like. Robert Bolick in England took these pictures at the library. And Robert has a copy of my micrographia revisited book. And he took my book to the library. And here's him holding my book at the opening page against the original. And here's him holding my picture of the flea in my copy of reproduction of his book and his original flea. And then here's the third volume, which is my image of the flea with scanning EM, showing how similar it looked to Robert Hooke's. And so that was a really interesting challenge, but turned out okay. Winnipeg has about 170,000 Dutch elm trees, many of which have succumbed to Dutch elm disease. So I made an artist book that focused on the story of Dutch elm disease. And Wood Anchor is a sawmill just outside Winnipeg that recycles the wood from diseased trees, and they remove the bark and they prepare boards from the wood. And I got some pieces of wood, which shows the beetle tracks in the cover, and made a book which tells the whole story of the Dutch elm disease. And it's called Demise of the Mighty. What? Anyway, here's a bit of how the book was made. And here's the cover, and I cut a hole in it for mica windows. And in that cover, I put entomological samples of bark beetles, which of course, as you saw in the last slide, make these tracks and actually pass on the fungus to beetles. This is a book I made as a fundraiser for the School of Art. It's called Intimate Encounters by Erwin Huebner of the Kingdom Plantae. And it's a concertina book. And it's a book of scanning electron micrograph images of plants. And I printed images of scanning images of plants on a long sheet of paper. This shows you how the book was made. Here are 3 strips, which were cut and then scored, and then folded into the concertina book. And running the length of the book is the names of all the botanists from Greek times to modern times. And I made 29 copies of this. Here are all the text blocks of that book. The covers are made with acid-free mat board, in which is embossed an image of a microscope that I cut out of a piece of aluminum and embossed into the cover. And then the books were jacketed in a jacket, and the title was put on the spine of the jacket and mounted inside bookcases. Now, and more recently, I've been made a set of books I call Earth books. And these Earth books are made with lapidary rock slices as covers. And inside the book are images taken of microscopic slides of very thin sections of stone that I got from a geologist friend. And some of these lapidary slices were slices my mother had cut with a diamond saw, and I have her saw, and I've cut and polished a number of others, as you can see some examples here. And on the right side are actually microscope images taken with polarizing microscopy of some of these microscope slides. And as you can see, they're an incredible array of patterns, beautiful imagery, some of which have bright colors, and some look like landscapes. So I made a whole set of these earth books. The largest runs around 6 inches tall to tiny miniature books, and they're all individual and unique. And here are some examples of those. Initially, I drilled holes in the stone covers to do the Coptic binding, but broke many diamond drill bits. So then I took and attached exotic wood strips, which were chosen to match some of the design of the lapidary. And that was easier than to drill for the Coptic bindings. And here, I've just got a few slides showing you examples of these books. Here's some examples of what some of the imagery inside looks like. So each one is unique. And here, each book has one page of text. Nature is painting for us day by day pictures of infinite beauty, a quote from John Ruskin. And here's a couple of the miniature ones, and these are the smallest ones I've made. On a somewhat similar theme, but rather than using lapidary slices, and here's a book I call Geological Explorations, which has a thin sheet of slate, which was manufactured for architects to use as wallpaper in architectural design, and had beautiful patterns. So I used that for the covers and then put imagery in this photographic book that I learned how to make from Robert Huell. Now I have lots of interesting wood, which some of which has really cool shapes. And wood is an amazing material, often used for book covers historically, and I call them gnarly books. And here is an example of a selection of some of these. The larger ones are about 1 foot high, and the smaller ones just a few inches. And the books focus on the fact that humanity has used wood over the millennia. We've depended on wood for heat, cooking, shelter, transportation, storage, warfare, and many other uses. It's a remarkable material with an incredible microarchitecture, which underlies its many properties. The images in these books show the amazing diverse features of wood that we can get a glimpse of macroscopically and microscopically using various microscopical techniques and instruments to reveal the views invisible to the human eye. And I have a collection of microscope histological slides of wood that I photographed and made these books, which are Coptic bindings. This is pecan wood from South Carolina. And here's an example of the images on one of the pages. And here's a few others and examples of some of the diversity of imagery that you see of the histology of the beautiful structure of wood. And here's a book made with Manitoba maple covers and has magnolia tree seed pod cut in half, attached to the front and back covers. And here's one of the images in the book. And here's a couple more. This is cork with lichen on the cover. And here's a book with interesting shape of the cover, and again, the imagery. Now, in Australia, there's a tree called Banksia, which has the most incredible seed pods. These can be anywhere from 3 or 4 to 6 inches in length. And if you cut slices of them, they make a really interesting looking book covers. And so I call these Banksia tree pod books, and they contain images of wood. Now, one of the organisms in the ocean that eats wood is called teredo, also called the shipworm, because it looks like a worm, but it's actually a it's a clam of which the shells have teeth on it that they use to bore through wood. And they chew up wood that washes into the ocean, piers, boats, and are been a problem around the world. And here's an example of a piece of driftwood that I've picked up on a beach. And you can see the holes from where the teredo have bored into the wood. And here's another really cool piece of driftwood that washed up on the beach that has been bored by teredo, and attached to the outside of the wood are barnacles, with barnacles attached to all kinds of things. But the inside of the wood has been devoured by teredo. And here's a few views of it. So here's a concertina book where the front and back covers are slices of boards that have been bored by teredo. I had the good fortune to meet a woman called Ruth Turner, who was a professor at Harvard, who was the world's authority on teredo. And she was the first woman to go down in a deep sea submersible to the bottom of the ocean and plant pieces of wood, boards in the bottom of the ocean, and then leave them there for a period of time to see if teredo would invade them, and then went back a few months later and retrieved them. And these are the pieces of wood from her research. I had the good fortune to teach in a field course with her for a short while, and she gave me these pieces of wood. And I also have some samples of teredo, so I could take some scanning EMs of the clams, their shells, which have these teeth. And so this book tells the story of teredo and a little bit about Ruth Turner. And you can see the covers are eaten. Here's another example. And in the book, here's a diagram of a teredo and how they bore into the wood. And here are some scanning EMs of the pictures in the book. So these were kind of cool and very special because of the connection to Ruth Turner. And I had a research or a grant from the university to explore some innovative book structures, and I proposed making a giant book that you could walk into the book, and also making a book out of glass. So here is a giant book that I made that's 4 feet by 6 feet, called 10,000X, and I made a miniature copy of it. And here is the book open and myself standing by it. The book consists of images of insects printed the size of a human. And there's 6 pages. Of course, the first page is a mosquito, since we're in Manitoba. And here's the miniature version, which is made just like the large one, and shows you how it looks inside as well. First, I made a maquette to plan the structure of the book. Here is making the frame for the covers of the book, which were then covered with a sheet of wood and then covered with actual book cloth. And then, whoops, let me just go back. And then the pages were inserted and hinged so the book could be opened. Now, having made that, I thought, just as a contrast to such a gigantic book, I'd show you this very smallest book I've made. Hetty Kyle introduced Blizzard books many years ago. And Blizzard books are made from folded 2 sheets of paper, one for the cover and one for the book that one can put inserts into. And here's a miniature version I made, the size of a penny here. And the book was small enough I could put it in the scanning electron microscope and actually take images of the book. And here you can see what the pages, the paper, the fibers in the paper in the scanning electron microscope of this book. Now, when you do miniature books, often the end pages in books are marbled paper. And so I thought for some of these miniature books, it'd be really nice to to make miniature marbled paper. And Janet Carroll, I learned how to make marble books from Janet Carroll, who does wonderful marbling here in Winnipeg, is extremely talented. And she told me about this book published in the 1980s by Christopher Wyman that described and showed examples of some miniature marbling, but it didn't have a whole lot of detail on how to actually do it. So I made a set of combs using insect pins of various spacing and created miniature marbled paper. And I made 2 concertina books that highlight examples of this marbling technique to make miniature marbling. Now, the other book that I got the grant for to explore making was to make a book out of glass. Now, they call it integument 1 and 2. Integument is the scientific name for skin, and the skin of animals, or skin of vertebrates, allows them to survive in all kinds of habitats. And the skin is adapted to survive whether it's underwater or in deserts or on land. And it's the boundary between living, the inside, and the outside, non-living. And so it has texture. So I thought I should make a book out of glass, which kind of conveys the fragility of life that skin protects. And here I made 2 copies, one with clear glass and one with colored glass. And the books have, the covers are aluminum plates, front and back, and on the spine. And they sit on a base, and the pages of the book can be turned out like swiveled out. And so I took skin of different animals. Here you see a cane toad from Australia and pangolin skin, made latex models of the skin. Here's rattlesnake, and then used those latex models to make wax models. This is pangolin. These are the different models. And then those were used to make molds out of plaster. And those plaster molds were then used for casting the glass. And here are these plaster molds of the wax models. The wax was burned out, and then crushed glass is put in those molds, and the pages are made in the kiln. And Matthew McMillan at Prairie Studio Glass did the casting for me, and here are some examples of the clear glass pages. And here is the frame in which these pages will be inserted. So these are the covers and the spine. And here there's text on each page, which is sandblasted through a template. And each page gives the property of skin, whether it's sensory or it's renewed. And here you can see a clear glass casting. And here is a colored casting. There's a hole drilled in each. And here you can see skin is renewed. This is the cast of the palm of my hand. And these are all the other different vertebrates. And here is a diagram to show how the pages would have been inserted on a rod that is attached to the front and back covers. And then there's a platform. And then I thought, gee, if they're on a platform, maybe it would be cool to light them. So I had the crazy idea to put LED lighting in strips on the platform. Here you can see it upside down. Involved a fair bit of learning how to do something crazy. And each LED strip has a switch. And so when you pull the book page out of from the covers out to look at it, it lights up that LED switch or strip. Here you can see them all flipped out, and here are all the switches. And here is the colored glass one with all the pages. And people were encouraged when this book was on exhibit to actually touch the pages and feel the textures of the skin and so forth. And it included a series of animals of different vertebrates. I've also been fascinated over the years with sturgeon, which is a remarkable fish. And I had access to skin from sturgeon at the university because they were rearing sturgeon in the lab for research purposes from eggs. And when they finished their experiments, they allowed me to retrieve the skin from these growing sturgeon. Namu is the Cree name for sturgeon. And here you see one of my books, which has sturgeon skin on the cover and a small stained sturgeon in the cover, and it's a concertina books. I also did some books on monarch butterflies. One of the students in one of my courses worked for an agency that was rearing monarchs, and she gave me one of the chrysalises that had died, hadn't survived. And so I made a little book using the chrysalis as the cover, and monarchs feed on milkweed. So I printed the text on milkweed paper. And here is a concertina book printed on milkweed paper. And then walnut shells here are the covers of a book that are hinged with dollhouse brass hinges. There's a species of ant that the entire colony lives inside a walnut shell. And I made a book where there's a concertina book that features that particular ant as though they're coming out of this book. And my daughter graduated from medicine and is now a trauma orthopedic surgeon. And this is a book I made as a graduation gift for her that has the bones of a rodent in a mica window in the cover. And I made a small doctor's bag out of leather and has a stethoscope and other instruments in it, a little microscope, and a section of a vertebrae in the cover. And inside the book are historic images of skeletal images that were prepared in the 16 and 1700s, very famous images. So there's a collection of these in the book. I've been fascinated by animal migration, and the champion of animal migration is Arctic terns. The record of an Arctic tern is a female bird that lived 34 years and flew from the Arctic to the Antarctic 34 times. She would have flown to the moon and back 3 times, 2 or 3 times. And so I made a book that has the keel of a goose that I found on a beach and a cover sewn to the book that has the title repeated 34 times from here to there and back again. And then the signatures in the book are sewn to the inside of the spine. And here you can see some of the signatures, and it tells the story of how birds, the structure of birds that allow them to migrate. So kind of a random assortment of books here, but a book that I was inspired to make when we were grounded by COVID is a book I called Grounded, and it's about the 1700s British warship, the Invincible, that was grounded in 1758 off Portsmouth. And here is a picture of the book. I had some artifacts from the book, which I'll talk about in a minute. And the book, the science behind being involved with this book was there were tally sticks, wooden tally sticks recovered from the wreckage of the ship. And they were sent here to Winnipeg. And a couple of us here in Winnipeg were asked to do research on seeing if we could decipher the writing on these sticks. And in my lab, we looked at this under different wavelengths of light. We could actually reveal the writing on these sticks. So we published a paper on how we could reveal writing on these ancient pieces of wood recovered from the bottom of the ocean. So, and I also, so that inspired me to make a book maybe about the story of the ship. And I made some etchings photo etchings of the story of the ship being grounded. I had some artifacts from the ship. Here's a piece of a hat shoe and some ink. And I had an ink barrel, and I also had some ink from the ship, which was iron gall ink. And so there's some writing in the book of ink. And the book tells the story of how the ship was built and how it grounded. It was built in France, was captured by the British, and then converted into a British warship. Then, of course, it grounded when the ship was leaving England to come to Nova Scotia to try to recapture Fort Louisbourg. And so that was an interesting book. There's lots more detail that I could talk about, but I thought I'd just skim over a number of these books. Science, a couple of years ago, invited me to make a book, a sculptural book that would celebrate the history, the 50th anniversary of the Faculty of Science. And thought about it, and this is the book I made, which consists of pages out of plexiglass that are mounted on a tray that has LED lighting under it. And the pages can be turned. Here it's open in the middle. Here it's with the first page, and here the pages are set in a pattern. So it takes on a sculptural feel, and it's mounted on a square, a case, a transparent plexiglass case that says 50th anniversary of science in a wood base. And so here are some steps in making of the book and how the pages were connected to the frame plexiglass, which was a bit challenging, as you can see here. And then the beginning of the LED lighting underneath. And then the plexiglass pages were laser engraved, and they contain, the pages contain the names of everyone hired academic faculty in the Faculty of Science from the early 1900s to modern times, all the deans and all the department heads. And running through the entire book is a red thread, which is the red thread that connects research between people and over time. Here's an assemblage of books that I made for Michael Nesbitt to celebrate his grandfather's famous contributions in England to zoology. Baird Hamilton was a zoologist that was on an expedition to Antarctica, South Georgia Island, to study how the whaling industry was decimating whale populations. So this is a modified stab binding, as you can see, with a wooden cover, but the cover can open because I've used a hinge. And inside the book is this, inside this trunk, which represents the, that he went to Antarctica in a steamer ship on with a trunk, and unfortunately died there. So it has the book, the story of his life, and Michael Nesbitt also funds a lecture series, a Baird Hamilton Memorial Lecture, and these other books are examples of images from some of the lectures. And some of those were done as flag books. Here you can see one of the lecture flag books, and when they open up, they showed illustrations from some of the talks. The university commissioned me to make this a book to celebrate the contribution of Michael Nesbitt to the building of a concert hall on campus, which is a beautiful building. And so I made this concertina book, which featured one of the symphonies, the music, and was given as a gift to Michael Nesbitt. And here's a similar concertina book that was for the retirement of a math professor, and it shows a concertina book with some numbers and math illustrations. So if there's still enough time, I could continue a little bit longer with some examples of books.
Yeah, I think we're good. Yeah.
That
Yep.
are about interesting books that didn't have a science basis. So on a trip to Santa Fe, I came across in an antique shop a little beat up antique concertina accordion, a little accordion, and I bought it. and I made a concertina book out of it. Concertina books are also called accordion books by bookbinders. And they were first initially developed in Japan and China as a replacement for scrolls, because you could fold them and open them anywhere. So this is a little case with a concertina book. That's an accordion book, and here's some accordion music. And I call this practice, practice, it's good for you. And here you can see, oops, sorry. Here you can see the original concertina book with its bellows. And I took the bellows out and replaced it with the concertina book. And I saved the bellows, as I'll show you in a few minutes. And here is the front and back of the accordion. And here's the concertina book. And the music in here is music that I played when I was a kid, and my mother had me take accordion lessons. And that's me in the first page playing accordion. And I was told by my teachers, accordion teacher, that I should keep practicing because it's good. And here's a second version of a accordion book using another toy miniature accordion, a Hohner, as you can see here. So that was kind of fun. I've enjoyed using concertina books for all kinds of photographs. Now, I had all my father's design drawings when he was the chief designer for Henry Burke's, and he did these beautiful design drawings of different kinds of jewelry. He moved from Edmonton to Chilliwack and opened up a goldsmith shop called Jewels by Huebner, where he continued to make custom jewelry for people. I thought about making the book cover out of gold, but that was a little prohibitive. So I made the book cover out of a sheet of brass. So it sort of looks like gold. And his favorite stone was BC jade. So there's a slice of BC jade I cut on the cover. The book itself is a montage sur onglettes binding so that it opens flat. And inside the book here are two of the pages are the actual the design drawings of my father that are throughout the book. And then my mother, who was also an artist, her name was Blondina. So I did a similar book called Dina's Story. Everybody called her Dina, a lifetime's journey. And she did a lot of work with fabrics and cloth and beading. And so this book has an interesting book cloth cover and marbled paper on the inside. And it's also a montage sur onglettes binding. And she did a lot of incredible dresses and crocheted pieces for dolls. And here she is with the collection of her dolls. She was a dressmaker. Here is a picture of one of the pictures in the book of her. She had a collection of Barbie dolls that she made these exquisite costumes for with incredible beadwork. And here are some examples of her beadwork of some of these Barbie dolls. Just spectacular, very tiny. She also did crochet jewelry with semi-precious and precious stones, bracelets, necklaces, and she also did beadwork of various kinds. And so I wanted to do a book that really highlighted her work. It was kind of an indulgence on my part. And I've been collecting interesting beer labels from around the world for many years. And on one of our trips through Ohio, came across an abandoned brewery, which was called the Huebner Brewery. And it had been in operation before Prohibition and went bankrupt during Prohibition. And I found some antique beer bottles that said Huebner Brewery on them. So I took and cut one in half to make the front cover a book. And I created a book which all the pages are the interesting beer labels that I've collected over the years. And the back cover has the beer caps, which also look very interesting. And inside the book, it tells the story of beer and the history of beer and the history of that particular brewery. And on a similar note, I had collected interesting wine bottle labels. And this is a piece of wood from a wine barrel and that I cut a little miniature piece out of. And these are content is scanned labels of interesting wine bottle labels. And then Uppercase Magazine every year invites about 15, 16 bookbinders across North America to do a binding of unbound sections from that year's publication. And I was invited to do one of these of the book that she published that year called Vintage Life. And so I made this book where the two covers are thin looking bookshelves with collections of various objects. And on the spine is ebony wood, letters cut out of ebony wood that say Vintage Life. And inside the book, inside the book are all the signatures that she provided, which were initially unbound. And that was a fun kind of project. And then here's a tunnel book that I made a few years back of southern Alberta, showing the mountains in the background and prairie scenes. And the book opens with two sliding doors that are images of a barn boards. And on my visit to Santa Fe, when I bought that accordion, I kept the bellows from it. And I thought, oh, the bellows would make a really cool tunnel book. But usually tunnel books are open in the top so that light can come in. And but I didn't want to cut that beautiful bellows. So instead of cutting that open, I strung small LED lights inside the bellows. And I had photographs of when I visited Ghost Ranch, which is where Georgia O'Keeffe painted and did a lot of her artwork. And I also visited her house, and I have images of the doors of her house. And here the front of this tunnel book has an image of a door in her house that when you open it, you look inside, and here are images of Ghost Ranch with the gate when you enter Ghost Ranch and some of the scenery When you open the gate here, the LED lights go on. And Ronald King, who used to live in Canada, now lives in England, years ago produced a beautiful, fairly large set of concertina books he called alphabeta books. And these were books that had the alphabet. And I contacted him and I got permission to make a copy of his book in miniature. And so here are my fingers holding a miniature, the opening page of that alphabeta concertina book that he published. And here is the concertina of this book with the alphabet letters, which are public letters. And here's a Canadian order for size. So this was challenging, and I had to use a scalpel to cut the pop-up letters so they would pop out. The back side of the book has the last half of the alphabet. So I think this is the last slide. So I've had a bit of an eclectic collection of books I've made that I hope have been of interest to those of you watching. And I apologize if I was a bit verbose.
No,
Thanks.
that was wonderful. I think let's stop sharing your screen so people can see your face. And so I'm just going to open it up to the audience here. If you guys have questions, if you want to type them in the chat, if you're shy, or if you want to just turn your audio on and ask a question, please feel free. I'm going to pick on somebody if we don't have any questions. Don't be shy, people. You can just say, "Oh my God, that was amazing," because that's how I feel right now.
Really spectacular work and such unusual materials too. Do you think part of your like braveness of using like glass and casting and those kind of things came from your experience working with similar materials in science, or do you just decide to do it?
Mostly just decided to do it. I mean, in science, I mostly just did photography and photomicrography. But I think I've always been fascinated by rocks like lapidary and wood. And both my sister Krista and my brother Ron did a lot of work in glass. And so, glass has been interesting in the family. And my sister Lorraine also did work in glass. And I, I have access to all kinds of tools, and I have my dad's a lot of the tools he used as a goldsmith, and I enjoy sort of hobby work. So, and the show we had years ago, Bound by Nature, kind of set the spark that you could use natural objects for book design. And I thought the covers of books, rather than, I've never been really into fine leather bindings, although I did some miniature fine leather binding with Gabrielle Fox, which was a lot of fun. And one of these days, maybe I'll take a course from Don Gleister on fine leather binding. But I thought it was interesting that one could choose a material for a cover that was linked to what the content in the book was, so that there's a kind of the cover itself kind of conveys or preludes what the content inside the book will be.
So there are some questions in the chat. People are very curious about how you cut the microscope in half and your other things that you cut in half, sort of techniques and uh, how you achieved that.
Well, it involved a lot of trial and error initially. So the egg books were particularly challenging because when you first I tried blowing them out and then cutting them, but they're so fragile they shatter. And then I decided if I left them intact and held them under just under the surface of water and used a Dremel tool with a very thin blade, diamond saw blade, I could cut through the shell. And when I did that, and they would drop in the water, I could pull the content out and then to very carefully lift out the eggshell, and it was completely intact. Then, of course, how to make it sturdy. Japanese paper is phenomenal for its strength and being very thin. So, and I've used Japanese paper in binding, so I thought that would be the way to strengthen them, and it worked beautifully. I gave a talk once where I had held one in my hand and it fell out of my hand onto the floor.
Oh no.
The students gasped, and it actually didn't break.
Oh gosh.
So they're pretty sturdy.
Amazing.
The microscope was a bit more of a challenge. Now, since I worked with microscopes, first I had to overcome the trauma of actually cutting a microscope in half because it's kind of a sacred instrument.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a diamond saw, a band saw that has a diamond blade. And so trying to cut the microscope in half while it's completely intact doesn't work very well. But if I disassemble it and cut each piece in half first, and then take all the assembled pieces and reattach them to each other, that included all the lenses, all the parts, and then I created, each half. So that was quite a big job and involved using special adhesives. And then if it all held together, then I would have the front and the back half. And they were actually pretty sturdy. And so it took quite a bit of while, and I had to do some polishing and grinding. Cutting glass in half can be done with a diamond blade. The lapidary stones, my mother did some lapidary work, and after she passed away, I ended up with her diamond saw. So I had collected rocks over the years, interesting stones. So I actually taught myself how to do lapidary slicing. So you could cut slices maybe 3 or 4 millimeters thick, maybe 4 or 5 millimeters thick, because it has to have some strength, because otherwise it'll crack. And then I have my diamond saw that I could cut into a rectangular shape for whatever the size of the book was. And then I have a polishing table with plates that have different diamond grit on them that I could polish them down, starting with a coarser grit down to a very fine grit, so you could get a nice, smooth, polished surface. Because the lapidary slices, when they're first cut, are kind of raw looking. So once they're polished, though, they take on a beautiful luster. And of course, cutting the wood into thin slices, that's pretty standard, using band saws and so forth. And most of the wood, I've left the natural look, and they're often sealed with Renaissance wax, which is used by conservationists, you know, to preserve wood.
Yeah. Wonderful. Amazing. Okay. Anybody else have a question or just want to tell him he's a genius? Because that's again what I'm thinking right here. So feel free to unmute yourself and pipe up.
Well, I would like to just make a little comment that just every time I saw something you created, and I would go, "What? Oh my word!" And then I thought, "Well, that's as good as it gets." And then the next slide, and the next, and the next, and the next. It's just a huge universe of beauty. Thank you very, very much.
Oh, thank you. I guess I'm just foolish enough to try crazy things.
Well, we like that. Stay foolish.
And keeping your brain and hands busy keeps you younger.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have a question. First of all, thank you very much for sharing. I think it was certainly inspirational, gave me lots of really cool ideas of things that I can dare to try now. But out of curiosity, what drove you to miniatures? Was it the challenge of working in such a small format, or?
Well, of course, everybody kind of likes miniatures. It's kind of a human thing. But as a scientist, I worked on insects, most of the ovaries of insects, and the bugs that I worked on, published many, many papers on, is a vinchuca bug, or also called the kissing bug, that's native to Central and South America and transmits Chagas disease. And to study how their ovaries make eggs, we would do microsurgery on insects that were anesthetized. And then I would take and cut a thin little bit of cuticle off the head of the insect with a microscalpel, and with microneedles go and take out single brain cells from these insects, and then put the cuticle back, and the animals would survive. And then we would see what effect that would have on whether they made eggs or not. And so I was used to doing microsurgery of all kinds of things. And I've done microsurgery on fleas and things like that to take out organs. So working at the micro level is kind of inherent. But then translating that to books was a challenge. I think the most challenging ones were the earth books with the rock covers, to do the Coptic sewing on a teeny book. So I'd have used really small needles and thin thread, but sewing a tiny Coptic binding, I must say, almost overwhelmed me.
So there were a couple questions in the chat. One person said, "What did your science colleagues and students think about your unusual creative endeavors?"
Most of them thought it was kind of cool. I think they were surprised and thought that I do crazy things.
One person wanted to know if your books are anywhere that they could see in person, like in a collection. Is there an academic library that's bought some of your stuff?
There's a couple in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, England. And I have a collection of them here at the university in my studio at the School of Art. One of the libraries in Texas has just contacted me about possibly purchasing a few of my books to add to their collection. But mostly I've done them for myself.
Right.
And I often don't, occasionally I do more than one copy. Recently I've been doing more copies, but initially I would often only do one. Like the Micrographia Revisited, I actually did 3 copies. So I've kept one. And Robert Bolick in England has one, and I think he's given it to the Bodleian Library. And a bookbinder in Portland, Oregon, we traded books, and she has one of mine.
Right. Right. All right. So lots of nice compliments saying you're the epitome of creative problem solving, which I would agree with. It's definitely inspiring.
When the previous question about what my science colleagues thought, they were kind of intrigued that, you know, somebody would do some research and I'd find out about it. Like one of the profs had a graduate student who worked on the biology of ants. And then I found out he was doing this thesis on these ants that lived inside walnut shells and hazelnuts. And so I looked up his research and publications. And I said, oh, these are really cool ants. And I should do a book with using the walnut shells for the cover. And so when I told them I was doing that, they were quite fascinated. And also I have colleagues that worked on Dutch elm disease in the botany department and microbiology. And so, you know, when I did that book, I wrote all the text and did all the research myself. But before I finished it, I had them proofread it.
Is it peer review?
Make sure that it was scientifically, there weren't any boo-boos in it.
Oh, wonderful. Anybody else have a question or a comment? Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to say anything.
I'm having fun.
Excellent.
Not sure what the next book project's going to be, but I'm mulling over a few ideas.
Wonderful. So yeah, I will send your email or your website around to people because someone's asking if we can see your books online, and your website has quite a few of the books that we've seen tonight, I think, are on there, right? Yeah.
It has most of them. It also has, I also do etchings and have a lot of photography on my website. My website was made for me by my brother-in-law, David Kilvert, who's a designer and designs websites. And when people used to bug me why I don't have a website. And so I thought, well, I could never create a beautiful website. So I hired him to create my website. And I think
it's wonderful. Yeah, he did a great job.
From comments I've gotten, people really enjoy it.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I'll include that in the email that I send around with the link to the recording. So it'll be on the public Cabbage page so anybody can see it, but I'll just send it to everybody so they've got it at easy reference. So yeah, any other questions people want to ask? I think I got everything that was in the chat. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I'm humbled that so many people have attended.
Well, thank you, everyone. I believe there are some problems with the access too. So thank you for being intrepid. And I don't know why that happened. Erwin had the same problem that you all did, and so something must have gone wrong in the email. It hasn't happened before, so apologies. But yeah, I think I'll just say thank you to Erwin for an amazing presentation. That was really inspiring, and I am pleased that we managed to work this out. And I chased him around for a while, and knowing that his work was fascinating. So thank you again for your time. And last chance for any questions, compliments. Otherwise, I think we will let Erwin go back to his regular life. Okay, well, thank you,
so
everybody.
much.
Yeah, feel free to unmute and say anything you want. So,
Thank you, everyone.
Yay.
Yeah, thank you. Highlight of the week.
yeah.
Thank you.